Hi everyone, I hope you've had a chance by now to watch the video where I talk about writing up the literature review. Today, in our last class session, if you will, and these last readings for this week in Stringer 3, 4, and 5, we begin to think about the process of analyzing data. So I know after talking with all of you on Monday, you all are in very different places with where you are going with this. So I'm just going to show you an example of some coding work that I have done, as well as that's going to be our assignment for this week, some practice with coding so we can think about what this might look like. Some of you are doing kind of focus groups, some of you have looked to do different interviews, others of you might be using different types of artifacts and documents that you're finding. So however you're choosing to organize your data, basically the main thing that we want to think about is how you're going to categorize it in a way that makes sense. When you get to the methods section in the paper, you want to, of course, talk about the methodology which you're using in the ways in which you're defining critical action research and how it's how it fits into your study. But you also are going to want to describe how do you go about analyzing the data. So Stringer, from page is 100 on, goes through and talks about these different ways of coding and organizing, and it's really just about being as explicit as possible. I'm going to talk about two types of codes today that I use the most frequently, and that's in vivo coding, which you see here in vivo coding, as well as socially constructed codes. So this sample manuscript that you can read through here, and I'll read the top here. It's it was part of focus groups that I held, and the participants are intern teachers, so they're practicing, they're learning to become a teacher while they're working on their master's degree. So this was a social justice focus group in which my role was that of the facilitator. So these you'll see that the dialogue that we're having here is a lot more conversational than a formal type of interview process. So I'll go through and we can look at a couple of these different coding systems as well as what's called analytic memos. As you're reading through the data, particularly the first couple times, a lot of times it takes reading through multiple times, your initial thoughts that come to mind or questions you have or things that you think about, you want to write that down so you're able to come back and think about it. So the first type of coding I'm going to talk about is in vivo coding, and that I have throughout here, I have this underlined through the text. What's so important about in vivo coding is this is when you really want to make sure that you're using the participants' actual words. I wrote this over here, the type of coding you do when you intend to use the participants' actual words. This can inform the next type of coding that I'm talking about, but when you're going to continue to use their words, you call that in vivo coding. And these are things that really stand out to you that you find might really be in alignment with what you're thinking about in terms of your research question, or it might raise you to consider even more questions as you work through the research. Now, the socially constructed codes, these are codes that you give a name to the type of phenomena that you see happening in the text as you're reading. So that'll make more sense as we go through. And you can see here that I had a bunch of different codes that I had created. One about education, social justice knowledge, one I called targeted populations, one I called white middle class population, reflection, equity and access, idealism, superhero teacher, something I termed practice teacher defeat, empowerment, and judgment stigma. Now, over time, as you're going through the first time, a lot of times you'll hear this referred to as initial codes. And again, these are your initial impressions as you're reading through the data. So as I begin to work through this manuscript, I'll read the first excerpt here from Natalie. Yeah, I had heard about the achievement gap and that sort of thing. I hadn't given it much thought, honestly, this school year until I took a look at the article because we don't have a high minority population at my school. And so when thinking about my students, I've been tunnel visioned. So this was kind of nice because I had experience with Project Grad 3 summers in a row. And knowing the difference about the accessibility about what these kids are going to get out, and also to just the idea of what the kids are capable of. I feel like at Hardin Valley, it's kind of the sky's the limit with most kids, and how there's always obviously exceptions. But I feel that also my experience at Fulton the last year was very different in terms of, I don't know if my kids can do this. And it's like, your kids can most definitely do anything you want them to. You've just got to scaffold them to get them there. So yeah, that was kind of digression. Okay, so looking back in this statement that Natalie's talking about, when I first went through reading this, my initial thoughts came out. So when we look at the achievement gap, I put a footnote, and you can do analytical memos. You might put over comments like here, you might put a footnote, you might have some other just writing in the margins. But I noted here that what kind of generalization is this? So questions that I'm asking to myself. What other associations does Natalie have with the achievement gap? So as I'm working through this and thinking about codes, you might go through and do those memos first, or whatever stands out to you. So I also coded the word achievement gap up here as education, social justice, knowledge. So there was something about what we were talking about in these focus groups that stood out to me in terms of Natalie thinking about the achievement gap. So you can also see that I went through and to me, I saw a lot of reflection. That was part of the reflective part of the process, was something that came out of this study. And so her saying I haven't given it much thought, honestly, until I took a look at the article, well, that's a form of reflection. So that's what I coded that. Like, okay, so she's thinking about what she's reading and processing, how this might turn into the school. So I'm going to call this reflection. We don't have a high minority population at my school. So again, I came up with a code here called targeted populations. And then I think later I included like the othering that when we tend to talk about people in comparison to white middle class norms. So that became a part of that code. And this continues. So this is how I organized this first transcript here with my different methods. Now this was very early on. This was the raw type of data. As time went on and I kept going through these transcripts, I kept focusing the codes more and more. And what happens is you end up collapsing the codes. So I end up putting them back together into smaller pieces to find the themes. This is called focus coding. This is something you might begin to dabble with, but at this point you're probably just going to be in this initial coding, beginning to think about what this looks like as you're thinking about these early themes that are coming out of your study. You can see I have more. You can also make, especially if you're doing participatory action and research where you're involved. I wrote a note here about myself that when we talk about the high school, I'm making this assumption that this statement means that it is not high minority population, it's a white middle class school. So I'm able to write my own assumptions here that I'm thinking about. So that's really helpful as you're going through and continuing to collapse the data. So this manuscript here, I'm going to put this up as well on the Facebook site so you can read through the whole thing. I did a 6-page excerpt, but you can read through my sample analytical memos, my sample coding here from this transcript. What I'm going to ask you all to do for this week, oops, wrong document, is do an example of a code, like what I'm going to be calling a coding workshop here. So I've got 2.5 pages here. This is an interview with a teacher. So I'm using sample data here. So to give you context of it, I'm interviewing a teacher. She's a white female teaching in a diverse service classroom during her first year of teaching. So she already has pre-screened my interview questions. So this is a lot more formal of an interview. But we're meeting at Starbucks over a cup of coffee to discuss how she uses culturally relevant pedagogy in the classroom. So it's an informal atmosphere. There's 8 slots here. I've copy and pasted here. So as you can see here, I have student 1. So when you come in, you're just going to go and type your name. So we know that this one is taken. And I go down and you can see there's student 2. Keeps going. 3. And then it keeps going all the way to 8. So there's 8 slots here. What I want you to do is go through and I want you to think about practicing coding. You can use any of the methods that Stringer talks about, organize this however you want. You can use what I called in vivo, the way that I used in vivo or socially constructed codes, or you can come up with any type of coding system. Use what you need to here. If you need to color code things, if you need to underline, if you need to add comments, use this Google Doc. It's a live document to think about it. You can also add analytic memos. So you can do this again by adding a comment up here, write a comment and write to yourself, think about that. Or you can also go to insert and then do a footnote. You can do a comment at the bottom. However you want to do it is fine. So whatever makes sense to you. Let me get rid of that. So what I'd like for everyone to do is to go through an initial round of coding, thinking about some things you see and notice. I'm going to go through and add some things to the document as well. And I'd like for you to comment at least 2 of your other classmates' analysis. What's helpful about doing collaborative coding like this is sometimes people help you to bring up things that you don't think about. And so that also adds another dynamic to thinking about coding data. When we think about validity, which I know we've talked a little bit about in action research, and particularly in qualitative research, this can be very difficult to do. Having member checking, having your participants go through and look through your documents and adding different things, different perspectives, or perhaps having follow-up questions. I know after me coding interviews with these teachers, I would have emails in which I asked to clarify some things, because ultimately at the end of the day, you are the person interpreting these words and placing meaning on them. So that's always a complicated part of qualitative research. From there, as you begin to do these initial codes, you can begin to do working through and thinking about what this looks like in terms of thinking about some preliminary themes. So that's what we're going to practice doing. I look forward to seeing what you all come up with, and this is going to be due Friday by midnight. If you end up needing more time, let me know. Otherwise, I know that you are all really digging into your actual papers, so happy reading. Good luck. I know that this is a really rigorous task, and I look forward to seeing what comes out of this.